TF Wire presents War Stories, a fan fiction podcast.
I am your host, Megatron, also known as Steve. What the War Stories podcast is basically is a fanfic storytelling podcast. It's released bi-weekly. There's one piece per show normally. On occasion there may be two, depending on the length. Basically, the war stories will be similar to that of back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, sitting in front of a radio, listening to your favorite TV shows, as Matrix Prime has said in a previous post. Well, we can get ready with the story today. The author is GCRN of the Allspark. The story is called The Anatomy of Betrayal.
Megatron will lead the Decepticons into the dustbin of history.
I let my words carry to the corpse I still hold in my hand before I finally let go of it, letting it pile unceremoniously to the floor. For an instant, a fleeting microsecond, I'm frozen in terror. I stare at the fluids already pooling in my palm and digest the horror. I've crossed the line. From here on, I will be nothing more than a traitor to my own, even if only myself will know of it. My fingers close in around the fluids in my palm. It's over. No one else saw. I can choose to back out at any time now. But that's not why I came here. If I ran now, then the murder I just committed would be meaningless. I have blood on my hands. The least I can do is make that mean something. I walk to the window, numbly. My legs are steady. They should be shaking. There should at least be shaking. Every processor in my head is screaming at me, condemning my actions as well as myself, and yet my body functions normally. I let my gaze sweep over the ruins. It was a beautiful city. I can admit that here, in the presence of the dead. That true crime was what our battle did to it, but its death is a fitting funeral pyre for the combat going on across the avenue. Optimus is down. I didn't expect that. A quick survey of the area reveals the cause, a lone pistol. Megatron must have picked it up during the confusion. This will make things all the more difficult, but it's nothing that cannot be overcome. My body moves on its own accord again, it seems. I make my way over the crumpled corpse and its two brothers, and while I calmly walk over the Decepticons I just murdered, my wind wanders back to that terrible moment a few moments ago. Optimus and Megatron on his knees, begging for mercy. This was the chance I had waited for since time immemorial. Megatron's constant state of warfare would lead to the destruction of the Decepticon race, be it through internal conflict or finally meeting an opponent we could not defeat. Our homeworld was dying, almost broken, but the Autobots were broken, driven off the very surface of Cybertron. An annoyance maybe, but there was finally a chance to repair, rearm, and upgrade for the next conquest. But there would be none of those things with Megatron at the helm. Instead, he takes a sledgehammer to a gnat, with obvious results. Eventually you'll hit the gnat, but not before all but breaking the hammer, and the Decepticons had been broken in the fight for this city. There needed to be a chance to rest, to heal. If that meant offering the Autobots a peace accord, then that was that. The Autobots should have been beneath the notice of the Decepticons anyway. Then I noticed Reflector in the building, preparing to snipe Optimus in the back of the head. That could not be allowed. If Megatron lived, then this prestige only grew, and the death of the Decepticon race was all but assured. So I had flown up to the window. I'd startled Reflector. I dropped two of his three bodies in my initial attack. The third had attempted to flee, but I'd cut him down at the knees before slamming him against the wall, and murdered him by crushing both his neck and shooting him in the chest point blank. I still can hear his last breath even as I move towards the hatch. He asked me why. I exit the building, flying up and arcing around even as I do so. It must appear as though I'm coming up on the scene from another part of the city. Appearances must be maintained after all. I touch down a little ways from Megatron, and I walk deliberately towards him. This, at least, is no act. While I hate the madman, years of service have still forced me to walk up and check. Surprisingly, he's still functional, though for how much longer remains to be seen. He looks at me with broken, defeated optics, and for another instant, I'm frozen into indecision. But Reflector's lifeblood still pools in my clutched palm as a gentle reminder of all that I have done, and all that I still may be called to do. Don't leave me, Megatron manages to rasp, still looking at me with those defeated optics. Soundwave! I kneel down. I place a comforting hand on Megatron's back, and thus intermingle the last of Reflector's life fluids with Megatron's own. As you command, Megatron. I scoop him up as I hear Starscream barking orders for the retreat. He will have to be dealt with as well, in time. He would make a useful figurehead. Not that I intend to make it an easy transition for him. Still, losing gracefully and offering my services couldn't hurt my own standing. I nod to Rumble to bring Megatron's fusion cannon. He and his brethren have no idea, of course. Megatron's earlier command to jam communications allowed me to separate myself from them for this critical juncture. They will be told in time. Reflector's comment comes back to me as I brave Autobot fire to get into Astrotrain's ever-expansive cargo hold. Starscream at least has the decency to wait for all to board before he himself does. That's a mark for him. As I cross the threshold into safety, I set Megatron down, and the gratitude in his face charms me. Truly, I've played my part well over the years. He still believes I am loyal. Perhaps a whisper in the audio receiver of someone, to get rid of the wounded. Obviously, they would only slow down or escape. Yes, that might work. I settle in, allow my partners to return to their stationary forms, and brood. The loss of Optimus will galvanize the remaining Autobot forces, and the death of Megatron and his obvious successor will throw the Decepticons into chaos, if only momentarily. What should have been a glorious new age of prosperity for the Decepticon people has become something else entirely. There's a good chance that we may even lose Cybertron, depending on who is chosen to lead the Autobots in Prime's stead. At least Megatron will be out of the equation, and that, Reflector, is the true reason for my betrayal. There must always be Decepticon people, and because of my actions there always will be. Come what may from this point on, at least the madness that has gripped the Decepticons has ended, and that still doesn't make me feel anything less than a traitor. And that was the first story by GC Rust of Allspark, and for the second, I shall play that next. And this title of this story is called The Anatomy of Command. Parts should be in Cargo Bay 14 by the end of the week. The engineers also wanted to take a look at the superstructure in Grid 5 Alpha 7 to make sure there's not some stress cracking. Also, research has requested an extra 20% draw of the power grid for a good 2 standard Terran weeks so they can... Ultra Magnus held up a hand and Perceptor paused and glanced up from his memo pad to cock an eyebrow ridge. Thank you, Perceptor, but I think that'll be all for now, Ultra Magnus said in his confident baritone. You can leave the memo pad on my desk, and I'll look over the rest and approve when I need to. Right now I think I need to take a little breather. Of course, Commander, Perceptor nodded, setting the pad down on the desk made out of orange metal. As Ultra Magnus tipped his massive chair back in a resting posture, the Autobot scientist cocked his head to his side and politely asked, Will that be all, sir? Yes, Perceptor. Thank you. Perceptor nodded and exited Ultra Magnus's office. As the hitch closed, Ultra Magnus let his chair snap back and he let out a sigh of tension. Leaning forward on his desk, he pinched the bridge of his nasal bump and shut off his optics for a moment. It was a gesture he'd copied from humans. and while it lacked any sort of physical benefits, the release of tension in something so minute helped his mental state far more than he would have allowed himself to believe, not even more than 6 standard Terran months before. Magnus winked as he stood, his servos whining in protest for a moment as the controls fought off the lockups of joints in need of a good oiling. Positive his legs weren't going to go out on him, Magnus walked around his desk, shooting the memo pad a slight look of contempt, and walked over to his floor-to-ceiling window on the main tower of Autobot City. City, being a relative term, given the half-completed skeletons of buildings and temporary recharging stations for the technicians and workers, both human and Cybertronian, responsible in construction. On most days, the sight of that frenzied but organized work gave Ultra Magnus some sense of pride, but today, Ultra Magnus let his optics settle on the far eastern corner of the city, and the green grass beyond. Clicking up the magnification on his optics, he brought into focus the gathering of humans just beyond the city limits, brandishing signs and shouting obscenities to any worker in earshot. There were more of them today, Ultra Magnus grimly observed. He hadn't realized there was a section of the human population so against supporting the Autobots in their ongoing civil war, but even that was secondary to the sobering indication that a vast majority of humans couldn't tell and didn't really care who was an Autobot or Decepticon. All they knew, all that mattered, was that Cybertronians had no business on Earth and should get off their planet. Ultra Magnus could somewhat understand their reasoning. Primus knew the Decepticons loved causing as much chaos as possible, but the open hostility to the Autobots and the construction of Autobot City in general had come as a shock to even the Autobots who might have been on Earth for some time. So for Ultra Magnus, handpicked by Optimus Prime to be city leader, and a new immigrant to Earth, it was even more jarring. Magnus was jerked out of his thoughts by a sudden flash of light near the western gate, his gaze immediately shifting. Magnus gaped in horror. The western gate was ablaze, the remains of a cargo truck evident around the blaze. A car bomb. As Magnus watched, the old warhorse Cup was all but whipping the younger Autobots Blur and Hot Rod into action in water hoses to put out the fire, while First Aid and the rest of the Protectobots raced into the blaze to look for the driver of the truck and the Autobot sentry on guard. This represented a dangerous escalation in hostilities to the Autobots, and Ultra Magnus tried to grapple with the concept of such a tactic, when motion from the other side of his field of view drew his optics back to the group of protesters. The protesters had obviously been waiting for the bomb, because they were already swarming that section of the city's construction. 2 human workers were dragged under the tidal wave of bodies, and Ultra Magnus could make out instruments in the protesters' hands, pipes, bricks, anything else they could use as a weapon. And that wasn't all. Chromia barely missing a well-tossed Molotov cocktail. Ultra Magnus sensed the chaos seeping into his command area, and for one instant was uncertain of the action he could take. But then his optics locked on the ground. There were 2 Transformers also watched the carnage. One was green in color, the other white and pink. Springer had his sword drawn and was stalking towards the violent protesters. RC seemed to be doing her best to stop Springer before he did anything rash. Memo pad forgotten, Ultra Magnus rushed towards the tower lift. As he did, he keyed his communicator.
"Blaster here,"
a familiar voice said over the comm. "Blaster, this is Ultra Magnus. I want every security camera and recording device trained on the western and eastern perimeter, ASAP. We need to get all the evidence we can, so make sure you can back up the readings."
"Understood, boss man. Should I send out a distress signal to the local authorities?"
Ultra Magnus entered the lift, hit the ground floor button, and waited for the car to begin moving before he replied. "Negative. Contact the state government and inform them of the situation. Local police won't be able to contain and neutralize that mob. We'll need the National Guard."
"And what about our side?"
Blaster asked, an edge creeping into his voice, almost like a sick hunger. Ultra Magnus was shocked to hear it. But after what just happened, he couldn't blame the generally cheerful Autobot. That's already about to blow up in our faces. I'm heading out to try and prevent an incident, but get a signal to Streetwise. I may need to detain a few Autobots.
Gotcha, Ultra Magnus.
Springer paid. All RCs, please, absolutely no mind. He just witnessed two good men with families to support, get beaten and almost killed just for standing in the way of that organic filth. Springer had never much cared for the organics of this planet, but he had to admit the majority of them weren't bad. He'd even become friends with some of them, but this was just too much. From the moment those so-called protesters had shown up, Springer had always known they'd be trouble. And now they were trying to rip apart what was going to be his new home, all because they didn't want the Autobots on Earth? What did they think the Decepticons would do if the Autobots didn't have a localized presence on Earth? Just ignore it? Springer brought his sword up. Even at this range, he'd cut down more than half the rabble. It would likely be enough to send the vermin scurrying back into their holes, and frankly, nobody'd miss them. Springer never brought his sword down. A powerful arm grabbed his arm just as he was about to swing, and struggle as he couldn't break free of it. And just what do you think you're doing, Springer? Ultra Magnus demanded, almost desperately. What do you think will happen if you kill them? The rest will leave, that's what. Ultra Magnus shook Springer. That won't help anyone. All it will do is prove their point. No lasting harm has been done so far. Mirage got shook up, but otherwise he's okay and the truck was remote controlled. And those two workers are knocked senseless, but still alive. Ultra Magnus pleaded. Look at them, Springer. They're causing a ruckus, but generally not damaging anything. If they wanted to, they could have torn down this entire sector. But they aren't. And the reason they aren't is because they want us to press first. Springer stared at the sea of organic madness in front of him, and couldn't see what Ultra Magnus apparently saw. Are you sure? He asked dubiously. Positive, the city commander nodded. Springer lowered his sword arm. All right. So they're just being annoying, but that still doesn't solve the problem of how we stop them from being so damn annoying. Eventually, they'll make one of our people snap. Streetwise and Blades are running interception for possible incidents, but I agree, we need to do something. Ultra Magnus's lips twitched in what was almost a grin, and the look in his optics was conspiratorial as he brought up his comm. Blaster.
Yo, boss man.
I need a feedback discharge in my location. Set it for 20 Terran seconds and patch me into the network. Oh, and don't forget our little bonus.
Gotcha.
Blaster practically grinned through the comm. Suddenly, every speaker operational in Autobot City let loose a howl of feedback. Autobots grimaced but generally turned down their audio gain. Humans, on the other hand, had no such option. The protesters stopped their mad rush to clutch their ears in agony as the sound cut into their very bones.
Now hear this!
Ultra Magnus's voice boomed from the speakers.
You people are trespassing on sovereign Cybertronian soil, and as such can be constructed as an act of war against the people of Cybertron and the Autobots in general. I, however, am feeling mighty generous today, and I give you the opportunity to clear out of here. In roughly 20 Earth minutes, troops from this state's National Guard will be arriving to arrest anyone illegally on Cybertronian soil. For your sake, I suggest you be somewhere else. Ultra Magnus' comm chirped, and he suppressed another smile. That chirp meant the bonus was active, and Blaster had just temporarily shut down the recorders. A rogue spike in the power grid. A shearing merely, but not unexpected, given a brand new fusion plant handling an untested load. So sad. And let me make something perfectly clear to each and every one of you.
Ultra Magnus's voice had taken all the gentleness of tempered steel. If I see any one of your faces in and around my city again, I will personally toss that person into lower orbit. Ultra Magnus looked out at the group of dumbfounded faces. See if I don't. And that concludes the story there, and I hope you enjoyed the two stories from GC Rust. And if you would like your story to be read on the show,
please post it in the War Stories forum on the TF Wire forums. After doing that, all you have to do is give us permission to use it in a future podcast. And this is Steve saying good night and good reading.
The preceding story was not endorsed by Hasbro and is meant for entertainment purposes only. All fanfiction stories are copyrighted to their respective authors, and all fanfiction stories used within this podcast are used with permission from the author. This has been a TFWire.com production.